Okay, so welcome back. This is part 3 in our series where we help you to become an expert in using C# Windows Forms charts. And if you've ever used them before, you probably know that they can be kind of confusing. The documentation can be frustrating. In this series, we help you to figure out how they work and what the basic concepts are, so it'll be a lot easier for you to use them. Now, I encourage you to look at the first 2 videos in this series. They help you understand some of the core concepts, and without those it can be very confusing. Most of my video series are in what's called a playlist, so I encourage you to look at some of the playlists. I get a lot of questions about the other videos in the series, but you can find those quickly using a playlist. So what we're going to do in this video, we're going to talk about some concepts that you see being used here in this application. And this is a logger application where I'm bringing data into my computer, and we go through this in a previous series, generating this application in C#. And right now I am grabbing in real time some data. I'm measuring the frequency of the wall outlet voltage and sending it into the COM port of my computer. And in real time, I'm measuring that data. You can see it plotted here in yellow. And what it's doing is it is scrolling the last 30 minutes of data. You can't see it moving because it's 30 minutes of data in here, but the latest data is coming in every half second. Here on the right, you may be able to see it updating. And the 30 minutes ago data is getting scrolled off the end. So this is a moving, scrolling window, and I can set the window over here. So we're going to talk about how to do that. How do you scroll data in a window in real time? We're also going to talk about scaling. So for example, I can enter a Y maximum and minimum scale for this chart, and I can even update it in real time. So I've got the maximum set to 60.2. I can change that to 60.1 and it automatically updates, and I can put it back, so we can do a lot of that. I've also got here in red, this is what's called a strip line. And a strip line is a very customizable way to highlight sections of your chart. And I've got a very simple one here in red. I'm highlighting the normal range of frequency that you will see from your utility. And you can see I've got it from 59.95 to 60.05. Basically, it's just saying, hey, the frequency, this yellow charted line, is going to stay inside this red area most of the time. And if it goes significantly outside, you know there's a problem. So it's a nice way to give a visual indication. So we're going to do scrolling, we're going to do scaling, we're going to do strip lines. We're also going to do what's called data binding. We're going to explain what data binding is. And it allows you to very quickly modify data that you want charted and have it automatically bound to this chart and updated when you change the data in the, for example, a list. So we're going to talk about data binding. Now, one other thing we're going to talk about is what I call a class template. And when you're setting up, you're defining your chart, you're setting up the axis variables, and you're setting up all the data, you can get into code like this, which is just monotonous, and you have to repeat the same thing over and over, and it gets kind of annoying. What we're going to do is show you how to make what I call a class template, which has in the background, it does all of this setup, and all you have to do in your main form is something like this. You define an object out of that template, and you just feed it the important parameters for the chart, and in the background, it goes through and it fills out all of the data using all of this code to set all the parameters that you want. So it comes down to like one line of code, and you can set up your chart. So a really nice way to do it. So we're going to talk about those and some other things in this series. I encourage you to hang with us and get a good feel for how charts work. So to understand these concepts, I'm going to use a very simple C# Windows Forms application that I developed. And that's right here. This is the application. And all I've done is I've taken a Windows Forms and I have drag and dropped a default chart. And I've also added a system timer. In the toolbox, go down to timer, drag and drop. And you can see I've got a timer here, and I've set it to enabled equals true. That's important. Make sure you enable it. And the interval to 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. And we're going to talk about the 3 or 4 concepts we discussed in this and they all kind of tie together. So let me start this application and show you what it does, and then we can break down the components. So I hit start, and here is my chart, and you can see I've got a y-axis from 0 to 15, and I am updating the data that's getting charted every second. You can see that it's starting out at 0, and now we're up to 7, 8, 8.5, 9, 9.5, and after 10 seconds it's going to start scrolling. So you can see I'm showing the last 10 seconds worth of data, and it's scrolling and knocking the oldest data off and giving us the new data. So we've got a bunch of things going on here, and we're going to talk about them. The first thing we're going to talk about is data binding. And we're doing this charting, we're updating this chart using data binding. So what is data binding? Well, if I look here, I've got my application, and the first thing I've done is I have defined two lists of doubles. And these represent the data that's going to be plotted. And I've got a list of double called xvals. That's a new list of double. That is the x-axis, or time axis in this case. Those are the values. And I've got the y-values, which is the number of values that are being plotted. And that's another list of doubles. So I've got both of these. So I'm going to be plotting the x-values versus the y-values. And they're both going to have the same length. And I'm going to continually plot these values. So what we're going to do is we're going to be modifying these values as we scroll the data. And every time we modify it for a new update, we're going to use data binding. So what data binding does is it allows you to define, in this case, two lists. And when I make a change to the lists, all I have to do is run the data bind method, and it will automatically refresh the chart with whatever values are in these two lists. So I've got the two lists I've defined. I'm doing some other stuff here. I go into my main form 1, initialize component. Here I'm just configuring the chart. These two lines are configuring aspects of the chart, which we'll talk about later. Here I've got a very simple way to define what I want the chart configuration to be. We'll talk about that. I'm just using one line with a bunch of parameters. And then I'm configuring the strip line, which we'll talk about. But this is just chart configuration. What's happening now in the using the timer is I've got a timer tick that is going to be doing the updating of the chart using data binding. So what we're doing these first 6 or so lines is we're just updating every timer tick. We're updating the x-vals and the y-vals. We'll talk about what we're doing a little bit later. But these are just updating the x-vals and y-vals. I then have two lines to update the chart x-axis minimum and maximum we'll talk about. But this is just basic configuration. And once I've got that done and I want to update the chart, I just run this one line which does data binding. And it's chart 1 series, and I define the default series 1, points.databindxy. And I'm feeding it the x values list and the y values list. So it's going to grab those two lists and update the chart. It's basically binding those lists to the chart. And when you run this command, whatever the state of those two lists is, it's going to grab that data and refresh the chart. So a very nice way to update the chart every time you call this. Now it's kind of like I did a video a while back where we showed data binding using a CSV text file bound to a data grid view in a Windows Forms application, which is kind of just a spreadsheet view inside the Windows Forms application. And you can bind that file to that spreadsheet view, and automatically whatever the state of the file is, it will automatically update the data grid view. So I encourage you to look at that if you're interested. So really that's data binding. Now you can also data bind just the y values by removing this x and removing the x values and just data bind y. But we're going to use xy. I find that to be a little bit more useful for engineering type stuff. So that's the basics of data binding. There's a lot more functionality in how you do it. I find this to be a very useful way to if I have to plot some lists, I can just data bind to the list. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is the scrolling window. All right. So we've got this window that we're going to have scrolling, and we need to first start and think about how we're going to do that, and particularly what we want on this X or time axis. Now, scrolling data windows, you have to think about what actually is it doing. Well, in most cases, you're probably going to want to scroll real-time data coming in. This is real-time random data that we're generating, but you could also grab data from your COM port or wherever and scroll it in real time. So generally, you're going to want to be doing scrolling with real-time data, which means that this x-axis is going to be in time units, right? How much time is transpiring. Now, there's a couple ways you can format these x-axes. In this case, I'm using the actual time values as x values. You could also use as x values relative values. So in other words, in my logger application that I've got here, where I'm measuring frequency, I am using fixed x-axis values from 0 to 30, which means that I'm showing a scrolling window of the last 30 minutes of data. So this is kind of a relative value. It's not the actual time values. You can either do the relative values or the actual time values. Here I've got the actual time values, and you can see here we're 56. So what is this actually doing? Well, if we're using a list, it's fairly easy to do the scrolling, because what we can do is we can add to, every time we get a new sample, each of these new samples on the right, we just add that to the list, and it tacks that onto the end of the list and adds a new element. But in order to scroll, we also want to remove the first element in the list. So when we do a data bind, it will grab all of the existing data in the list and refresh this chart with those values, which means we're going to have to remove the lowest or 0 value in the list and add to the newest, so it will keep scrolling. So that's basically what the scrolling is going to be doing. And in our timer, our system timer, we're going to be doing that scrolling. So how are we going to do it? Well, as I said, we are going to add in the xvals list our tick value. And basically what we're doing is we're starting at 0. We're starting a tick at 0. And each time the timer gives us an event, we're going to increment that tick. See down here, I'm incrementing it by 0.5. And I'm going to add that tick value each time I get a new timer event. And I'm going to increment the x value, and I also need to increment the y value. And here I am adding a random number. You can see I have instantiated a new random, which is going to generate random numbers from 0 to 1. So I'm just taking a random next double and multiplying it times 10 to get from 0 to 10. And that's the new x values value. So I'm adding on to these two lists a time and a value. And then I'm going to data bind them. But in order to do the scrolling, what I've said is if the tick value is greater than 10, so in other words, I want to hold the last 10 values or the last 10 seconds or whatever. If it's greater than 10, what I'm going to do is automatically remove the 0th element in each list so that it will scroll. Right, so I'm removing the 0th element in the x vals and the 0th element in the y vals. So I'm adding and then removing, so that's how I get the scrolling. And then what I can do is, here's where I can decide what I want to show in the x-axis. Here I'm setting the minimum to whatever the first value in the x-axis, whatever the tick value is, I'm setting the minimum to that and the maximum to the latest tick value. It's giving us this scrolling chart where I'm going from, in this case, 0 to the latest tick value. Once I've got all that, all I'm doing is I'm doing this chart 1 series points data bind x vals, y vals, And it's whatever I've done here, it's going to automatically refresh the chart and update it. So a very nice way to do your chart updating, because generally or very often in the engineering world, you're going to want to modify both the X values and the Y values. So it's nice to be able to do whatever you want here and then just call a data bind XY and it will automatically refresh. Now, one thing that's really, really important that you keep in mind if you're doing a data binding in this way with a data bind XY and you've got two lists is to make absolutely certain that when you do this data binding, both of the lists in this case have identical lengths, identical number of values. Because if you don't, you're going to get a crash and you're going to scratch your head and say, well, why did this crash? I've got two lists. But they have to be they have to have corresponding values. So for every X value, there's got to be a Y value. So to show that, what I've done is I've said, when I start scrolling, in other words, if my tick value gets greater than 5, I'm not going to remove the 0th element of the X values. I'm going to let it increase, which means the X values, the length, the number of elements in the X values is going to increase while I am removing and keeping fixed the number of elements in the Y values. And what we're going to see is this thing is going to crash after about 5. So I'm at 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5, and now it's going to crash. Aha. It says enumeration has either not started or has already finished. Now, if you can figure out what that means, good luck. But what it's saying is you can't have lists, you can't data bind to lists that are of different lengths. Very important to keep that in mind. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is what's called a strip line. And you can see in this chart, I've got this reddish pink area that's highlighting an area of my chart. So why do you want this? Well, previously we did a logger application where we're measuring system frequency of your power company, the frequency of the voltage at your wall outlet. And we said that it normally ranges in this very narrow range of about 59.95 to 60.05. So it provides a very nice visual indication of what the general typical normal range of frequency will be. So you can, at a glance, you can see if it goes outside, hey, something's going on. There's many different reasons you'd want to have something like this. This is a very simple version. But a strip line is the ability to have a custom highlighted area of different colors. You have gradients, you can have all kinds of things. You can have multiple strip lines. There's a whole lot of customization you can do, but I'll show you how to do a very simple one like this. And we've got the same thing here in our application where we've got a simple strip line. So how do you do it? Here where I've got the configuration, I'm setting up the general parameters of the chart. I call it a graph. And then I'm calling this config strip line method. It's a very simple method, but it will show you the code you're going to need to generate a simple strip line. And again, with Microsoft Windows Forms charts, there's a lot to it, but it's really nice to have like a separate method, or what we're going to show in a bit, a kind of a class template that has all the state in the background, and you just give it the values. So there's basically these lines of code you're going to need to generate a strip line. First, you're going to have to instantiate a new strip line. So I've got strip line, I'm calling it strip line 1 is new strip line. Then you're going to have to give it a width. And this is a width of the strip line in actual x-axis values. Very important. This means there's 5 units of your chart is going to be the width of your strip line. Let's start up our chart, and you can see that we've set it at 5, and it's this from here to here, which is about 4 to 9. So it's giving us a width of 5. And again, it's an actual values of the y-axis. All right, very important. It's not like a relative number. It's the actual values. So we've got the width is 5. The interval is 0. What the interval means is, as I show here, draw the strip line only once. So if I say interval 0, that means I just want one occurrence of a strip line. I can increase this and I can have multiple strip lines, but 0 just gives you 1. The interval offset. Now that is the location of the bottom edge of the strip in actual Y values. So again, we set it at 3.5. You can see it goes from 0 to 5, and this is 3.5. So here is the interval offset, and then it has the width of 5. Very important that you understand what those mean. And then strip line back color, color from RGB. I'm using a alpha, which is a transparency of 120, which is like 50% transparent, and a color of red. So that's what you need to configure it, but then you need to add that to your chart. So chart 1, chart areas, chart area 1, .axis y, .striplines, .add, strip line 1. Okay? Unfortunately, you got to go through all of this just to make a simple strip line, but as we're going to show next, you can do a class template that has all of this in the background. You just give it the important numbers so you can set it up. Now, one other thing we're going to talk about, if you've ever worked with charts in C# Windows Forms, you know it can be incredibly annoying and time-consuming because you get a lot of code like this, where you have all of this code just to set up like minimums and maximums and intervals and what the data is. And really, all you need to feed it is a few numbers to set all this up. You don't need to repeat all of this stuff. So what we're going to talk about is a way to make what we call a class template that you can use in just about any project where you have charts, and you can just copy and paste that class template code, and when you run your application, all you have to do is run a single line to set up your chart, something like this, where I am instantiating what I call the line graph class, and I'm calling it graph 1, and I'm saying new line graph. And for the constructor, I'm just feeding it a bunch of numbers that define chart minimums, maximum, which chart I want to configure. I can set up all kinds of stuff. And really, most of the stuff, all you need to do is give it a number. You know, that's the important thing to you. What are the minimums? What are the maximums? What are the values? All the rest of this stuff is because Windows needs all of these names. So this is a great way to put all of this code in the background and not have to constantly repeat it, and just feed these numbers to configure your chart and get it ready to go. So all I'm doing is I'm going up to the my project, right-clicking, and then as with anything, you add new item or add class, and it will give you this class. And I have I'm using System, Windows, Forms, Data Visualization, Charting, System.drawing, and then I am setting some properties that we're going to use. For example, x-axis maximum, x-axis minimum, interval, y-axis max, min, and interval, line width, line color, and for example, unfortunately, Windows, if you want to change the thickness of the line that you're charting, that's called border width. But you can name it something that makes more sense. You can call it line width. So that's another benefit. You can use these, you can name these variables however you want that make more sense. So line width, line color, minor interval. So you can set up all of these depending on what you want to, depending on how you want to configure your chart. So I've got all these public properties. And then what I'm doing is I'm setting up a constructor. And of course, the constructor has the same name as the class. So I'm saying public line graph. That's my class, line graph. And I am setting up a constructor, and I'm feeding it all of these values, and I am setting those values in this code. So if I go back here, I can hover over this. I can see line graph. I'm setting the x-axis minimum, the chart name, the x-axis maximum, the interval, the y-axis minimum, y-axis maximum. So all I have to do is enter these numbers and I can set up my chart and I'm all ready to go. So again, this is a really nice way to not have to constantly go through all of this to set up your charts. Just make a class and instantiate that class and give it some numbers in the constructor and you're all set to go. So that's about it, I think, for the charts. This one, again, I encourage you to look at the previous videos to get some more info. And if you like any of these videos, please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications. Most of all, let others know that we're here so we get some more views. Appreciate it. Otherwise, take care and have a really good day. Thanks.